The engagement of Mary of Teck and Prince Albert Victor. The brief courtship between Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence, and Mary of Teck is a fascinating glimpse into what might have been, though, in hindsight, the path history took was likely for the best. As the eldest son of the Prince and Princess of Wales, Albert Victor was second in line to the British throne, behind his father, while his formidable grandmother, Queen Victoria, reigned. Born prematurely on the 8th of January 1864, he grew into a man whose reputation was clouded by doubts regarding his character and abilities. This very uncertainty, however, provided an unexpected opportunity for Mary of Teck, an aristocratic yet relatively penniless young woman with diminishing royal ties, to step into the spotlight as a potential future queen. In November 1891, Mary of Teck received an invitation, more of a command really, from Queen Victoria to visit Balmoral Castle in Scotland. Mary, the eldest daughter of Francis, Duke of Teck, and Mary Adelaide of Cambridge, Duchess of Teck, had a modest upbringing despite her royal connections. Her mother, a granddaughter of King George III, lacked both wealth and conventional beauty, limiting her social advancement. However, she remained close to Queen Victoria, earning favour through her charm and public service. In return for carrying out royal engagements on the Queen's behalf, especially as Victoria had withdrawn from public life following the death of Prince Albert, Mary Adelaide received a modest parliamentary allowance and was granted residence at White Lodge in Richmond. There was little ambiguity about the purpose of Mary's visit. She was being evaluated as a suitable wife for Albert Victor. His personal feelings mattered little. The Queen's approval was paramount. Mary was no stranger to Victoria's family, having spent considerable time in their company. Unfortunately, her impressions of Albert Victor were less than flattering. Known within his family as Eddy, Albert Victor was neither intelligent or diligent, showing little intellectual curiosity. Worse still, he had been unkind to Mary in childhood, bullying her despite being 3 years her senior. His early birth may have contributed to developmental challenges, including undiagnosed learning difficulties and hearing impairments inherited by his mother, Alexandra of Denmark. Both Albert Victor and his younger brother George joined the Royal Navy as teenagers. While the experience instilled discipline and purpose in George, it had little effect on Albert Victor, who remained listless and unfocused. Some accounts suggest that he may have suffered from undiagnosed mood disorders, exacerbated by his heavy drinking, which began in adolescence. Like his father, he frequented brothels, but unlike his father, rumours of same-sex relationships surrounded him, leading to speculation that he might have been bisexual. Before his brief engagement to Mary of Teck, Albert Victor had pursued a romance with Princess Helene of Orleans, a French Catholic. However, marriage between them was impossible unless one of them converted religions. Two extreme solutions were considered, either Helene renouncing her Catholic faith or Albert Victor forfeiting his place in line of succession. The latter option, while unlikely, did raise discussions about his suitability for the throne, with some in royal circles believing that his younger brother George was the better heir. Ultimately, the Pope refused to grant permission for Helene to convert, and British authorities would not have entertained a royal union with a Catholic princess. By the summer of 1891, the relationship had come to an end. Would history have been different had Albert Victor married either Helene or Mary? Perhaps, but in the grand scheme of things, fate had other plans, and as it turned out, they were likely for the best. As Albert Victor's health began to decline, though the exact nature of his illness remained uncertain, the need to secure his future and that of the monarchy became pressing. It was against the backdrop that Mary of Teck was summoned once more to Balmoral. As a young woman of noble birth but little fortune, she was seen as a suitable and persuadable candidate for marriage to the ailing prince. Mary arrived at Balmoral with her brother Adolphus at midday, and they were greeted by Princess Beatrice, Queen Victoria's younger daughter, who resided at the castle with her own family. Beatrice escorted them to the Queen, where a brief exchange of pleasantries took place before they joined the household for lunch. Among those at the table were Beatrice's eldest children, Alexandra and Ina, the future Queen Victoria Eugenie of Spain, whose presence Mary disapproved of. She did not believe that children should dine with adults. Mary spent the following days in close company with Queen Victoria, joining her on daily walks, sharing meals, and observing her management of royal duties and correspondence. This experience provided Mary with her first real exposure to the inner workings of monarchy, a role that she would later embrace and defend throughout her life. Though the details of their conversations remain unknown, by the time Mary departed Balmoral, the Queen had given her blessing for an engagement. She wrote to her eldest daughter, the Dowager Empress of Germany, expressing her approval. "You speak of Mary of Teck. I think and hope that Eddy will try and marry her, for I think she is a superior girl. Quiet and reserved until you get to know her well. She has no frivolous taste, has been very carefully brought up, and is well informed and always occupied." With the Queen's endorsement secured, the Prince of Wales soon wrote to his mother, confirming that Albert Victor had agreed to the match and that a proposal was imminent. On the 2nd of December, Mary travelled to Luton Hoo to join the Wales family for a grand house party. Among the guests was Arthur Somerset, recently returned from abroad after fleeing scandal due to his connection with a notorious brothel raid. The following day, Mary attended a luncheon for a shooting party, though as someone who detested blood sports, she likely found little enjoyment in the affair. That evening she attended a county ball in a gown so extravagant that one guest described it as monstrous. During the ball, Albert Victor invited Mary to step away for a private conversation. He led her upstairs to a quiet bedroom, where a fire was already burning, evidence that the moment had been carefully arranged in advance. There he recited a rehearsed proposal, and Mary, ever dutiful, accepted. She later recorded the event in her diary. "To my surprise, Eddy proposed to me during the evening. Of course, I said yes," although she felt suppressed excitement throughout the evening and danced around her bedroom in delight. Mary's reaction was not born out of love, and she had secured the most desirable match in Britain, ensuring her family's stability and her own future as a potential queen. For a practical woman, that was cause enough to celebrate. The engagement was swiftly made public, and Mary returned to London that afternoon to find cheering crowds awaiting her, a first-time experience in her life. To her credit, she took to the attention with ease, smiling and waving as if she had been born into it. Later, she and her family, her parents and brothers, joined the Prince and Princess of Wales and Albert Victor for a celebratory luncheon at Marlborough House. For the relieved Walesers, the engagement marked a successful resolution to the question of Albert Victor's future. The next day, the newly engaged couple travelled to Windsor Castle for a week with Queen Victoria, a visit nearly likely anticipated with much enthusiasm. Albert Victor, in particular, was in low spirits. He had just received distressing news that his former tutor, rumoured to have shared a complicated, possibly romantic history with him, had been institutionalised. He even suspected that news of his engagement had contributed to the man's decline. Despite the tense atmosphere, the visit proceeded as planned. When Mary returned home on the 13th of December, she found a letter from Queen Victoria waiting for her. The Queen, ever pragmatic about marriage, wrote, "Marriage is the most important step which can be taken, and should not be looked upon lightly or as all roses. The trials of life, in fact, begin with marriage, and no one should forget that it is only by mutually giving to one another, and by mutual respect and confidence, as well as love, that true happiness can be obtained. Dear Eddy is a dear, good boy." But the man Victoria described did not match the one that Mary was coming to know. Albert Victor spent 2 days with the Tecks after Windsor, and during that time Mary broke down in tears to her mother, overwhelmed by the reality of her engagement. Her mother's response was characteristically unsentimental. Mary had no choice in the matter. The wedding was scheduled for the 27th of February 1892, and Queen Victoria arranged for the young couple to begin married life in apartments at St James's Palace. In the meantime, Mary and Albert Victor attended social events, including a festive dance hosted by his sister, Louise, Duchess of Fife. Mary wrote of the evening, "We danced to a most lovely Viennese band, which played several things. It was a charming little fete, and we all thoroughly enjoyed ourselves." As Mary busied herself with wedding preparations, the absence of her future brother-in-law George was notable. He was recovering from a severe bout of typhoid. Further disruption came when Queen Victoria's half-nephew passed away in Germany on the 31st of December. Albert Victor was sent to represent the Queen at the funeral, returning with a nasty cold. Meanwhile, court tensions flared when Princess Helena, Victoria's daughter, expressed outrage that her own unmarried daughter had not been considered as a bride for Albert Victor. The Queen, however, swiftly put an end to her complaints. Days later, Mary and her family were invited to join the Waleses for a week-long celebration of Albert Victor's 28th birthday, but the visit proved anything but joyous. Illness spread throughout the household. Mary and her mother caught colds. Albert Victor's sisters, Victoria and Maud, were battling the flu, and George was still recovering from typhoid. Meanwhile, the Prince and Princess of Wales were embroiled in one of their many marital disputes. Amidst the tension, Albert Victor and his father sought refuge in daily shooting excursions, no doubt relieved for an excuse to escape the house. George, still too weak for such activities, remained indoors, where he likely spent much of his time in Mary's company, a seemingly minor detail that in time would take on far greater significance. On the 7th of January, the eve of Albert Victor's 28th birthday, the household gathered for a luncheon. George escorted Mary to the table, and while the meal passed without incident, disaster struck immediately afterward. Albert Victor fell suddenly ill and was confined to his bed. Mary remained by his side, reading aloud to keep him company, while George took on the task of responding to his brother's birthday correspondences. Determined not to let illness overshadow his birthday, Albert Victor insisted on coming downstairs the next morning to open his presents. The effort, however, proved too much. His fever soared and his condition worsened. By the 9th of January, his health had deteriorated significantly, prompting the Prince of Wales's physician to be summoned. Despite their best efforts, his symptoms only escalated. By the 14th of January, his fevered mind had slipped into delirium. He was heard shouting at Lord Randolph Churchill and Lord Salisbury, neither of whom were present, and calling out desperately for his grandmother. In what must have been an especially uncomfortable moment for Mary, he also cried out for Helene, Helene, a reference to his former love, Princess Helene of Orleans. By then, it was clear that nothing more could be done. In the early hours of the 14th of January, the Prince and Princess of Wales, their other children, and Mary gathered at his bedside to keep vigil. For 6 long hours they watched over him, and at 9:35 a.m., Albert Victor took his last breath. The room fell into silence. Once his death was confirmed, Mary quietly rose from her chair, walked to where the Princess of Wales stood, and kissed Albert Victor's forehead before wordlessly leaving the room. To this day, some historians and royal watchers have speculated about the nature of Albert Victor's death. It has appeared suspiciously convenient. He had long been regarded as mentally unstable, and many in his family and at court doubted his suitability for the throne. Theories have circulated suggesting that his symptoms did not align with influenza, but instead pointed to poisoning. However, such claims seem unlikely. The Prince and Princess of Wales were deeply devoted to their son, and his mother was utterly devastated by his passing. The idea that they would have sanctioned his murder is far-fetched. If Queen Victoria or the Prince of Wales had wanted to remove him from the line of succession, they could have done so long before his engagement to Mary. Likewise, the notion that someone within the government orchestrated his death remains purely speculative. Nevertheless, a conspiracy theory persists, lingering as an unanswered question in royal history. With Albert Victor's death, the country plunged into mourning, and the public sympathy turned towards Mary of Teck. Many believed that she lost the love of her life, as well as her chance to become queen. She attended his funeral, but otherwise withdrew from public life, returning to her parents' home and resuming life as if it had been before her brief engagement. Yet Mary was not cast aside. She remained close to the Wales family and continued spending significant time with them, particularly with George, who had now taken his brother's place as the heir presumptive. In a development reminiscent of a novel, the two formed a bond that soon blossomed into love. Unlike the infamous case of Catherine of Aragon centuries earlier, there was no significant obstacles to their marriage, as Mary had never actually wed Albert Victor. After a respectful period of mourning, George proposed in May 1893 and Mary accepted. Their wedding took place 2 months later at St James's Palace in London, and they were granted the titles of Duke and Duchess of York. Their rise was swift. Less than 8 years later, following Queen Victoria's death in 1901, they became the Prince and Princess of Wales. 9 years after that, in 1910, they ascended the throne as King George V and Queen Mary. Together they ruled for 25 years until George's death in 1936. Mary, however, would go on to witness yet another remarkable chapter in royal history, living long enough to see her granddaughter, Elizabeth II, crowned Queen in 1952.